But for everybody, this is Dr. Spencer Wells, one of the world's leading geneticists now, a graduate of the University of Texas. Yay, hook 'em horns. Received his PhD at Harvard University, studying under the esteemed Richard Lewontin, one of the leading figures in the field of population genetics. Then postdoc at Stanford, on to Oxford, and since then has revolutionized how we look at the history of human migration, how we moved out of Africa to where we all are today. His work for 10 years with National Geographic's Genographic Project set the stage for the modern day consumer genomics field. I often refer to Spencer as the godfather of that field. And he will probably tell a little bit more about his current efforts with Incytome, his not-for-profit think tank to deal with issues related to the consumer genomics revolution that we find ourselves in. So I'll ask Spencer if you'll share a little bit of yourself for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up to question and answers. I'm going to mute everybody right now just so we don't have any surprises, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Well, thanks for the introduction, John.
And wait, let me unmute you. There we go. You should be good now.
Am I okay?
You are.
Okay. Thanks for the introduction, John. It's great to be here. I'm very honored to be able to talk to everyone. Biology teachers make such a critical difference in, of course, teaching about the field, but also serving as mentors for young students who may not realize that they could pursue a career in science. Mentors make all the difference. Kids need role models to kind of mold their lives after, and so you guys are doing such an important job. So as John said, I grew up in Texas, in Lubbock, in West Texas and Panhandle. My mother and stepfather were both academics. My mother was a professor at the medical school. Stepfather was as well. My mother also went on to become dean of research at the medical school. So I grew up in a scientific family. And so I was kind of primed to want to study science from a young age. And, it was a really interesting time to be getting into biology when, I started pursuing my career. So I graduated from high school relatively young at the age of 16. That was in 1985. And I had this sense that genetics was about to undergo a revolution. Our ability to sequence DNA had just been developed, less than 10 years before by Fred Sanger and Wally Gilbert, for which they won the Nobel Prize in 1983. And so, genetics was top of mind, but it was, the technology was so primitive in those days compared to what we have now, that there just seemed to be a lot of scope in the field to innovate and to use it to answer deep questions. I mean, I have never been particularly interested in medical genetics, but I've always been interested in history ever since I was 8 years old. So it was the fall of 1977, and I went to see the King Tut exhibit that was touring the States at that time in New Orleans with my family, and was blown away and was just fascinated by the ancient past and read everything I could on ancient Egypt and Greece and Rome and all of these other great civilizations, very much kind of self-taught on the ancient history side. But by the time I was getting into my undergraduate studies, so I double major in biology and chemistry at the University of Texas, was really convinced that genetics was going to be the key to this. And, I was at the time approaching it more from the perspective of what can genetics tell us about deep evolutionary history. The origin of life was something that I was very interested in at the time. But also just how can you use genetics to infer what we now call phylogeny, so the relationships between organisms. And how can we detect the effects of things like genetic drift and natural selection using genetic data? I mean, it was all brand new. And the final year at UT, so I did a lot of research experiences in virology labs and genetic mapping labs and so on. But my final year, I did an independent research project with Professor Mark Kirkpatrick who is actually a professor in the department that I now hold a faculty appointment in myself at the University of Texas. And Mark is just a genius, brilliant theoretical population geneticist, a mathematician's mind, but a biologist's sense of, what are the important problems. And he, as of today, I just got the email from the faculty newsletter this morning. He's just been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, so that's a huge honor, and he very much deserves that. But anyway, we did an independent study class in topics in theoretical population genetics, and it really convinced me that that was what I wanted to do with my life. And he said, well, listen, if you want to do that, if you really want to apply the tools of modern genetic technology to the study of these, ancient questions in evolution, the best person you could work with would be Dick Lewontin. And I said, I can't get into Harvard. And he said, how do you know? You haven't applied. And so I applied and I got in. And so in 1989, I packed up my belongings in my little Volkswagen and drove up to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and started down a career path that has led to all the stuff that John told you about. But underlying all of it is just this fascination with how evolution works. We're seeing this now with the coronavirus pandemic, the extraordinary ability of evolution without any sort of preconceived plan, without a brain behind it, to innovate and create solutions to problems. In this case, how do you infect as many people as possible and reproduce as much as possible as a virus? It's just extraordinary the way evolution works, and I continue to be blown away by it. I mean, I am living in a house right now. Right as I look out my window, I'm looking at Wallace's line right now. And, evolution is just endlessly fascinating. I can't imagine ever getting bored with it. So, that is the thing that has really tied my career together, is just this fascination with the history we carry written inside of our DNA. Our strands of DNA take us back in time through the earliest humans, through the origin of the hominin line, through the origin of the hominids, through the origin of the great apes with proconsul 23 million years ago in North Africa, but all the way back to the origin of life on Earth. And they connect all of us into a web of interrelationships that is, endlessly fascinating. And, there's always so much more to do. And, I turned 50 last year. I just turned 51 a few weeks ago. And, at this point in life, you're kind of thinking about mortality in a different way. It's like you realize that, okay, as Bill Clinton famously said, you probably have more yesterdays than tomorrows. And, I'm starting to think that, there's so many things I want to study and there's so little time. There's so much to do in this field. So anyway, that's a quick introduction to me and what's motivated me as a scientist. And I'd love to hear from you.
That's great. What a wonderful start to things. So what I'll ask folks to do, if you don't mind, if you can digitally raise your hand, because I can't see everybody all at once, and we'll call on folks there. And this is, I'd say, certainly not a time to be shy.
I don't bite, certainly not via Zoom.
Yes, but will you cross Wallace's line to get to us?
Would I cross? Yes. Yeah, no, I mean, it's so fascinating being able to travel through Indonesia the way we have over the last few weeks and to literally see those changes in the fauna and to imagine I did a podcast on this. You've probably listened to it, John, but my most recent Insight podcast is all about Alfred Russel Wallace and the history of how he got here and why he came here and why it was so important to his thinking. But to be able to literally go to those places and to see, the changes in fauna across Wallace's line is fascinating. Yeah. I can see why he came.
And that, I guess that for me is one of the things, is this idea of travel. And in this time of coronavirus, you were kind enough last month to speak with my sixth graders about this. And now that you've traveled, the virus, of course, travels so well. And you might share with folks some of what you're up to with the coronavirus and your interest in that, because that's something I think a lot of these folks won't yet know about.
Yeah, so back up a little bit. One of the things, I left National Geographic in 2015, and I was an explorer in residence, as is Lee Berger, who you probably also have spoken to. Lee's a good friend and a brilliant scientist, fantastic paleoanthropologist. But I was an explorer in residence at National Geographic for over a decade, from 2005 to 2015. And one of the perks of being an EIR at National Geographic is you occasionally get to lead amazing trips because they have this incredible travel program. And so I did a couple of Lindblad cruises, one up into the Arctic Circle where we got to see polar bears in the pack ice, and went to Svalbard where they have the seed bank and all of that. One across the South Pacific where we got to scuba dive in atolls that no one ever goes to because they're out in the middle of the ocean. And so that was cool. But my bread and butter for Nat Geo Travel was designing and leading private jet excursions. So round the world trips. And then, those, I did a few of those, and, I was like, well, let's start to focus on more specific stories and regions. And so designed and led 9 of those for National Geographic during the time I was there. And they're incredible experiences, very expensive. And, I was very lucky to be able to go on them. But after you've done a couple, they start to feel a little bit like very high-end bus tours, because you've got 80 plus passengers and half a dozen staff and tons of people to move around, and you're literally sitting on buses when you're not sitting in this very nice private jet. And I always wanted to design more intimate private jet trips, using a Gulfstream, for instance. Like the trip we did most recently was a G550. So 8 to 10 passengers, people who are really committed, have done a lot of work. I record podcasts for the passengers before they ever come on the trip. Most people listen to them on the way over to the start off point. So, in this case, flying from the West Coast of the US to Singapore, there's a lot of time to listen to me, just bore you to death with stories about Alfred Russel Wallace and volcanoes and how they affect climate patterns and so on. But anyway, they come very well equipped. And so then we set off on these very small private jet excursions, which are quite luxurious. And the great thing about having a smaller plane is that you can land in more remote and unusual destinations. And so that opens up a lot of possibilities. So, we took them up the river in Borneo, in Sarawak, to go see the orangutans at Camp Leakey. Where Barute Galdikas, of course, had done her studies for so many years and is still active there for a few months a year. We took them to the highlands of Sulawesi, to Toraja land, where the people, when they die, they let the body effectively mummify in the back room of the home while they save up enough money to buy buffalo. And they have a huge feast where they, slaughter the buffalo and feed everyone in the village. And the body is interred in a cliff face in a hole that is hammered out of the stone over the course of 3 months. So just to be able to see stuff like that is amazing. So anyway, long story short, after I left National Geographic, I really wanted to pursue this. And the kind of grandmaster, the original, kind of godfather of private jet travel, a guy named T.C. Schwartz, who had founded the company called TCS World Travel in Seattle, that runs all the trips for the Ivy League, that runs all the National Geographic trips, et cetera. Just tremendous level of travel expertise and logistical expertise, people with, decades of experience in the field. And TC is a genius, and a very successful business person. He sold and is now living in Singapore. But he and I started talking about, this concept of doing smaller, more focused trips, and, put together a couple of itineraries, including the one we just did, which we called Eastern Indonesia and the Wallace Line. And for various health reasons, TC's in his 70s now, some family issues. He wasn't able to continue as a business partner, but he said, listen, you should take this and run with it. And so my wife and I last year formed our own company called Shambhala Expeditions. And we are doing these very small boutique trips with a small number of passengers. We never have more than 10 or 12 people, depending on the itinerary, and very curated experiences. And our first trip was to Indonesia, and that's how we ended up here. It's not like I was sitting in Austin, Texas, and said, "Hey, the coronavirus is happening. Let's fly to Indonesia." We happened to be here leading this trip, and everybody absolutely loved it. We have, customers for life, basically. They all made it home safely. We had to end the trip a few days early because it was becoming very clear that borders were going to be locking down. Singapore, in fact, had locked down its borders. So if we had gone back there as originally intended, everybody would have had to go into quarantine for 14 days, and no one wanted that. So we got them out via Denpasar, which is the main airport in Bali. Has lots of tourists from all over the world, so it has a lot of international flights. And they all flew home via Emirates, and Emirates via Dubai. And so everybody made it home safely and healthily, and we had a wonderful time. But that's how we ended up here in Indonesia. My wife and I, at the end of the trip, after we'd gotten everybody out, looked at each other and were like, we're seeing all these stories about people waiting 6-8 hours, in customs to get into the States. Nobody's wearing a mask. When we had flown out to Singapore on the 27th of February, we'd gone through LAX, and there were like TSA agents coughing in their hands and asking for our passports. And we were like, no, we feel like the US is probably the least prepared developed country for what's coming. And unfortunately, it turns out that was correct. And so we decided to stay on in Indonesia, and that's why we're here.
Well, do we have any initial questions there, follow up on that?
John, I have one that's not necessarily related to coronavirus.
Okay, go for it, Lynn.
Dr. Wells, I'm really interested in your study of the migration of man. And I was wanting to know, would you share any moments that you had where the process of science really helped you on your journey? As part of our program, we're trying to show students science in action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, listen, science underpins everything. I mean, science went into, most recently, the decision to stay here in Indonesia. I studied virology and immunology as an undergraduate, including doing research in a retrovirology lab for about 4 months one summer, and, have always been fascinated by it, in part because it kind of intersects with my interest in the origin of life and an RNA world and catalytic RNA enzymes, the Tom Check work that, he won the Nobel Prize for, et cetera. That was all coming out when I was an undergrad. And, when Laurie Garrett's book, The Coming Plague, came out in 1994, I bought literally one of the first copies that hit the bookstore that was closest to me, and devoured it and became fascinated by emerging diseases. And this, in my studies of human history, I've written a book about this called Pandora's Seed, about the transition to agriculture, the Neolithic Revolution, as it's called, and the causes of that, why it all happened at the same time around the world, and what it led to. But one of the big things I talk about is the rise in zoonotic diseases as a result of domesticating animals and living very close with them. And so, again, this has been a theme that I've been interested in for a long time, and I know a fair amount about epidemiology, in part because my mother was basically an epidemiologist in the second half of her career, and I grew up discussing things like R0 and attack rates and things like that around the dinner table with my parents. So it's kind of second nature to me. But no, I mean, science went into the decision to stay here because I could see that this was probably going to be that worst case scenario the WHO had been planning for a long time. And the action that I took was very real. I mean, we took a risk. We went to a very small remote island, a little east of here, which was actually one of the stops we were planning to go to on the jet trip. So we already had reservations, and it was prepaid, and we weren't going to get a refund. So we said, let's just use up those days and head over there. And there were no cases there at that time, and the virus slowly started spreading in, and the Aman owners in Singapore, the owner of the chain of resorts, decided that it just didn't make financial sense to keep it open for us. We were the only guests staying there, And we luckily had been kind of adopted by the general manager and his family, an Indonesian couple who are based here in Lombok. And they said, listen, we have a great house for you to stay in. We can, arrange a very affordable deal for rent. And, why don't we just head back to Lombok and sit this out there if we can't stay here? And we said, absolutely. So, science led to all of those decisions. And Frankie, the general manager, has trusted my decision-making about this pandemic very much. And it's gone into our decision-making as kind of this, extended family, and where we've moved and what we do and how we wear masks when we go out and so on. So, talk about science in action. I mean, this is a time when I think science is probably more relevant to everybody around the world than any other. I just wish there were more scientists in the US government.
Thank you very much.
I think a lot of us are feeling that way these days. And maybe, is that something you want to jump on? What the issue of science denial, as someone who's traveled as widely as you have on this, do you see it in other places?
Not in the same way as the US. So this is something I talked about again in my book, Pandora's Seed. The US is a real outlier in the world. When you look at OECD countries, so these are the large economies in the world, which is really the only fair way to make comparisons. So people who potentially have access to education and the ability to make, independent decisions about what they believe in and what they don't believe in. When you graph per capita GDP, so basically how rich the country is, versus belief in evolution, there's a very tight regression line there. It's a very linear relationship. So as countries become richer, people become better educated, they tend to have a more widespread acceptance of evolution, except for the United States, which is one of the richest OECD countries. It's not the richest, but it's one of the richest. But it has literally an evolution acceptance rate or belief rate down around the level of Turkey. Turkey, of course, being a relatively conservative now Muslim state. It's officially secular, but that's starting to change and may end up changing in my lifetime. But, much poorer, traditionally, much less developed. We think of it as being, a poorer country. But our acceptance of evolution in the US is down around their level. It's only around 40%. So the vast majority of people in the United States don't believe in evolution, or they doubt it. And this plays into all sorts of poor decision-making on the part of our policymakers in my home state of Texas. People like Dan Patrick making statements about the coronavirus where he's saying things like, well, I don't care if people die as long as we save the economy. The opposition to abortion and a woman's right to choose. The opposition to the teaching of evolution in schools, the opposition to any notion of human-driven climate change. No, I mean, the United States frightens me. It really does. And especially somebody, I've been an expat before. I lived outside the US for 6 years when I was at Oxford, and then lived in Geneva, Switzerland, and knew a lot of people at the WHO, which is another way that I kind of absorbed stuff about emerging diseases. So we would have conversations about Ebola and stuff around the dinner table with a lot of our friends. So I've been an expat, and I've seen the US from the outside. I was living in the UK when 9/11 happened. I was traveling in Central Asia when 2008, the economic crisis started to emerge, and I was watching these weird stories on CNN. And I'm like, what the hell is going on back in the US? And, I'm living outside the US now, watching what's going on. And it is very frightening to watch the Trump press conferences, for instance, and the complete science denial that's going on. Unproven therapies, injecting household cleaners into your bloodstream. I mean, my God, it's like listening to a witch doctor from the 13th century. So yeah, I'm very concerned about the lack, or the science denialism, for lack of a better term, in the US. It's a real worry, especially because the US is such a powerful country, and because the presidency is a bully pulpit to the entire world. I mean, when Trump gives those press conferences, he's not just talking to you, he's talking to 7.7 billion people all over the globe. And quite frankly, he has become a laughingstock, and the US has become a place of pity for many people as a result of that. There was a really good op-ed piece published in the Irish Times yesterday, where a very good Irish writer wrote about, the United States has always loomed large to the entire world for various reasons. It did amazing things in World War II. It saved Europe. It saved Asia from Japanese imperialism. It, liberated Europe. It created the Marshall Plan, et cetera, et cetera. People love America, but they also hate it in some ways because of the militarism and, the forays into Vietnam and the Middle East that have led to so much unhappiness and bloodshed in those regions. But the US is always front and center for the entire world. And so it's frankly embarrassing when I see Trump giving those talks, because, it's not that I'm watching it live, it's on at a kind of inconvenient time of the day, but everybody can go into YouTube everywhere in the world and watch it for free. It's streaming for free. And so everybody sees this and everybody is like, what the hell is going on in the United States? Literally, people in Indonesia are like, what's going on in your country? So it's, it's a scary time.
I was Dr.
Hi.
Go for it.
I had a question and I put it on text as well. I had an opportunity to live in Sumatra for about a year. And,
oh, wonderful.
Yeah, and I personally felt that there was a lot of poverty.
Yep.
They were less educated versus I come from India, so I had seen the other kind of education. Mm-hmm. And how do you think that Indonesia is monitoring this virus spread? And what happens when the second wave shows up? As we all know, that there would be another wave of infection.
Yeah, I've written a lot about this on Twitter and in my blog. I call this pandemic the revenge of the peasants, because oddly enough, the people who are doing best in this pandemic are poor agrarian societies in the tropics. And that has to do with the heat and humidity. So we've seen that data and heard about it. We saw it at the press briefing a few days ago. People tend to live outside. They're not crammed into office cubicles with air conditioning on, breathing each other's exhalations. They are very good at listening to the authority figures in the country. There's a sense of social cohesion. So, when Jokowi, the president of Indonesia, says, you're not going to travel during Ramadan, which he did last Friday, nobody's traveling. And when he says everyone has to wear masks when they go out, everybody wears masks and they practice social distancing. You don't see the sorts of demonstrations that you're seeing in Wisconsin and other places in the US with people carrying assault rifles over their shoulders, shouting that their constitutional rights are being violated. It's very odd. I made this somewhat snide remark on Twitter this morning about someone posted something about the case fatality rates so far in different countries. And I said, it's extraordinary that is effectively a transect of Anglo-Saxon culture. Okay. So the US being the apogee of kind of libertarian Anglo-Saxon culture, colonialism, libertarianism, freedom, freedom of speech, freedom to do exactly what I want to do, down into countries like China and Vietnam, which are much less like that and have done so much better in this pandemic. So honestly, I'm not that worried about things in Indonesia. I think Indonesia is going to come out of this just fine. I'm worried about the U.S. economy collapsing. I think that this is the nail in the coffin for Western Eurasian civilization and its hegemony. Anyone who reads The Economist, for instance, a magazine I've read since I was 20 years old, has known for a long time that the center of gravity, they actually have a wonderful illustration of this, the geopolitical and economic center of gravity of the world, which had been moving toward the West for the entire 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, has been moving back toward the East. This is going to push it all the way over to Asia. So, Asia is going to come out of this probably running the world. And, they're already giving aid to the US. They were providing masks and respirators, and, it's a different world now. It's a very different world. And it's, as I said, kind of the revenge of the peasants. It's interesting to witness. I've never seen anything like this in my lifetime. I never thought I would see anything like this. But this kind of global geopolitical and economic shift that's going to happen over the next decade is unprecedented. It's like the fall of Rome. And so, that's what's coming, in my opinion. And that's the reason why we've decided to move to Indonesia. We live here now. We've now taken all of our money out of the US because I'm concerned about the banking system collapsing.
Thank you, Doctor.
Anyway, that I don't want to get on a soapbox about that. But so, yeah, no, I think it's very interesting. And so, yes, I mean, listen, Sumatra is the most fundamentalist Muslim part of Indonesia. And in general, there's a gradient across Indonesia from west to east. So by the time you get to Papua, people aren't even Muslim at all. And in Flores, where our general manager kind of, friend is from, they're Christian, so it was Dutch missionaries. So they were raised Catholic, but you get into Java and everybody is Muslim. In Western Java, they're particularly strict. And in Sumatra, they still cane people. They have public canings like they do in Saudi Arabia. So, it's a very diverse country. There are 17,000 islands here. And so we're looking at this, and, the places that are hardest hit are the ones that are the most fundamentalist so far. So it's Western Java and Sumatra, and then this little pocket of fundamentalism in southern Sulawesi around a city called Makassar. And the reason why that's so hard hit is because the people who live there are known as the Bugis people, and the Bugis are the successful traders and merchants in Indonesia historically. Big fishermen, traders, merchants, and they've settled all over the region. But because of their economic success, they have a lot of clout in the government. And so several senior government ministers have come from that region of Sulawesi. So they have a very modern airport, very modern roads. It's crony capitalism. They basically shift all this money back to their hometown. And because of that, they have like 10 flights a day to Jakarta, which is the hardest hit part of so basically that's where you see it. It's like, it's really hard hit around Jakarta and Sumatra. And then in the one place that has very close ties with Jakarta in the east. And everything else is pretty calm, quite frankly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm from Mississippi Gulf Coast area. And I'm very curious, as I have been following your career, you have done extensive studies, extensive travels. And I'm curious as to what really stands out in your mind as the most surprising. You've already talked about how even into this pandemic, how your scientific mind led you to the decisions that you had. When did you get to a place and you went, wow, this is not what I expected at all?
Not sure I completely understand the question. You mean relevant to the coronavirus pandemic or just in general?
Basically in general. I'm just curious as to when you proposed that a certain line of thought was going to play out and it surprised you. It was not what you expected.
Oh, all the time. All the time. I mean, a good example, just, in a very kind of genetics focused way. I led the first modern expedition to the Tibesti Mountains in Chad in October and November of 2005. We took an overland route from N'Djamena, the capital, up into the Sahara Desert through a 500-kilometer wide minefield that forms the border between Libya and Chad. And, it was dangerous as hell. Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb was operating in some of the villages we sampled in, and we were told by people in the village, it's like, you need to go now. Otherwise, you will not get out of here alive. And so, we collected all these samples from these populations that had never been studied before, and it was utterly fascinating. We got back into the lab and we started getting the results, and they were carrying European Y chromosomes. I mean, these are sub-Saharan Africans or Saharan Africans. They look, as African as a Kenyan or, somebody from Nigeria. And And, you know, unpacking that was really interesting and surprising. And it led to, you know, a new understanding of the interplay between the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa and the back migrations that have happened through that region. So yeah, I mean, scientifically, that's the reason you do this, to discover new things that you didn't know before. If every scientific experiment confirmed what you were expecting, there would be no point in doing it. It certainly wouldn't be as fun.
Based on that, I'm curious, if you were back, say, in high school or undergraduate nowadays, knowing kind of what you know now, where would you start your new career genetically or evolutionarily?
Well, I wouldn't study the same things that I studied in my career, because when I was coming up through the system, biology was still very much a hands-on kind of laboratory experimental science. And at least in my field, it's now entirely quantitative. And I feel like I could have benefited from, you know, I took quantum mechanics, I took calculus and so on, and a lot of statistics, but I do not consider myself to be a mathematical biologist. You know, there are people who work in my field now in population genetics who have PhDs and postdocs in theoretical physics. Like, their mathematical skills are way beyond mine. And they're the ones in many cases who are, you know, creating these new insights into the huge data sets. So, you know, I would focus if I were going to end up doing what I'm doing now, I would focus more on statistics, mathematics, you know, mathematical modeling, big data, as it's called, you know, learning how to understand the patterns in big data. Because, you know, again, when I was young, when it was still really difficult to sequence DNA, you know, we would generate a tiny amount of data over the course of several years and then wave our hands and like throw some statistics at it. And, you know, it was never significant because we didn't have enough data for anything to be significant, but we would see patterns and then write about speculations and so on. And now there's just so much data that, like, we don't even know what patterns to look for. I mean, there are AIs that are developed that are constantly kind of poring over the genetic data sets because humans just don't have the bandwidth to look at every possible, you know, correlation. So yeah, I mean, that's what I would do if I were going to go into this. AI is another thing. You know, AI is fascinating. AI is powerful. AI is going to have a huge impact on society in a way that I think people who don't follow AI don't completely understand yet. You know, Peter Thiel, who was one of the co-founders of PayPal and is, you know, a wealthy investor, invested in Facebook. He's a billionaire, lives in Los Angeles. He left Silicon Valley because he doesn't like the politics, and he lives in LA now. But his latest venture is a company called Palantir, and very few people have heard of it. Hardly anybody knows what it actually does, but what it does basically is it uses AI to analyze all of our personal data. It has a profile on you. The US government just hired Palantir to do all of the data analysis on the COVID epidemiological data. And so AI has a huge impact on the world, and everybody is profiled in some way. And, you know, we all know this from something as simple as a credit score. I mean, that's a form of data profiling that affects everybody's life. So AI is going to have a huge impact on human life and civilization in the future. Not all of it good. And so, you know, I'm a little concerned about this. And certainly, you know, the fact that Peter Thiel is a little bit of an evil scientist worries me. But so AI would be another field. Neuroscience is a very exciting field. And, you know, the advances that are being made in the understanding of how memories are formed and emotions. The idea that it actually is becoming tangible to be able to see memories and to actually recreate those memories in another brain by manipulating it in certain ways. That's fascinating to me. Because, you know, if you think about it, if you think about the Cartesian universe, Descartes, how do we know that we exist? The body-brain axis, and can you have a brain without a body? Can you have a mind without experiencing the world? The whole notion of consciousness, you know, it's just central to human existence because we don't really have that much going for ourselves apart from advanced consciousness. So it's you know, part and parcel of understanding who we are as a species. So neuroscience, really, really exciting to me.
Cool. Next question. Let's keep things going. I don't know how much longer we have you, Spencer.
About 5 more minutes. Is that okay?
Okay.
Maybe one more question.
Okay.
I have a question. So one of the things that we do a lot of at NTSE, and one of the things that, I mean, a lot of us have experienced in our classrooms is combating misconceptions, especially about science. So one of the things that I've been seeing a lot, you know, with the coronavirus and other things are people jumping to conclusions based on anecdotal evidence. I mean,
Believe me, I've been fighting the Corona Wars, as I call it, on Twitter for months now. And, you know, I said relatively early on when I started seeing those, you know, very complex, diverse phylogenetic trees of sequences coming out, it's not going to be easy to develop a vaccine for this. And the pushback I got from that simple statement from scientists who just want to believe, I guess, that there's going to be a Salk-like vaccine that's going to save everybody and this is going to go away. That's not going to happen. But yeah, I mean, anyway, sorry to interrupt, but I've experienced that firsthand. It's insane.
So I guess my question was, what do you think might be the best way for, you know, scientists and science educators to kind of fight back or teach other people, normal people, about how to analyze evidence and how to make
you have to engage with the public. I mean, the reason why, how should I phrase this? I feel that most academic scientists are very poor communicators of what they do, the importance of what they do, why it's relevant to society, and what the key takeaways are for the average person. I feel that there are very few academics who do that well. Lee Berger is one. I think I do a pretty decent job. You know, Razib Khan, who works with me, does a very good job. You know, but there aren't that many good, solid communicators, people who are practicing scientists, who have high H indices on Google Scholar. You know, they're above 40 and, you know, still are able to communicate these complex ideas to the average person. I think that's something we need to be encouraging people to do. And unfortunately, academia doesn't do that. You know, it's gotten better over the last 10 years, but I can tell you that when I wrote my first book and made that film, Journey of Man, back in 2001, 2002, you know, the pushback I got from scientists at Oxford and Stanford and some of the other places, it was crazy. It's like, you know, only the anointed few in the ivory tower are allowed to discuss these ideas. And, you know, how dare you, like, you know, popularize these incredibly complex concepts? And, you know, to me, if you don't do that, what's the point in doing your research at all? I mean, if your audience is 57 people who are going to cite your paper in some obscure journal, why is the government footing the bill for that, in my opinion?
Well, I can attest. Oh, hi, I'm Bailey Blanchard. I'm a teacher in Louisiana, teaching middle school science, and I'm making a move to Dallas to teach high school biology, which
awesome.
Thank you. And I can attest to that. I mean, I'm 25, so I was an undergrad at LSU not that long ago, and I noticed a difference where my professors were brilliant. They were brilliant, but they weren't there to teach. They were really there to do their research because it was a research university. So you have this divide where you have these incredibly intelligent people who aren't necessarily teachers, and they have a wealth of information to share, but it's almost, here's my slideshow, I want to get back to the lab, right?
Well, but you understand the perverse financial incentives in academia, don't you? Maybe not. So universities, state universities are a good example because, you know, more people go to state universities than go to, you know, elite private schools like Harvard and Stanford and so on. So University of Texas, I'm on the advisory council for the College of Natural Sciences. And so we get to, you know, have private conversations with the dean about the budget and things like that the average person isn't privy to. When I was an undergrad at UT Austin in the 1980s, 50% of its operating budget came from the state. That figure is now 9.3%. Okay? So states have decided in places like Texas, but everywhere in the US, that they don't value education. They don't like higher education. They're actively opposed to it. They are cutting the budgets. Even as everyone talks about, we need more education. People need to retrain from blue collar jobs and move into different careers. They have actively sought to defund public education. And so the universities have made up for that by raising tuition, which is the reason why when I went to school, basically I could work a part-time job for a few weeks in the summer and pay tuition, quite honestly. It was so cheap back in the 80s. And now, if you're in state at UT Austin, it's like $20,000 a year. And if you're out of state, it's over $40,000 a year for a public university that used to be called one of the best bargains in higher education. So, they've raised tuition, but what they also have come to rely on more and more is indirect costs from R01 grants, NIH grants. So the way indirect costs work, I hate indirect costs. And when I was running the Genographic project, we capped them at a very low level of 10%. But basically, it's a tax the university pays on any grant that a researcher gets that funds all of the administrative costs, which is why the number of administrators has ballooned over the last 2 decades in academic institutions. Now, what is a reasonable level of taxation to support the university and its administration? Well, like I said, 10% seems fair to me, maybe 15%, possibly you could push it close to 20%. Do you know what indirect costs are at the University of Texas? 70%, 70. Do you know what they are at some private research institutes like Scripps in San Diego? 102%. So in other words, when somebody gets $1 million grant, the government actually has to pay the university another $1 million on top of that for the privilege of having the research done at that institution. And that's what has funded, all of the expansion in administration. And because the administrators are beholden to that system to pay their salaries, they're often very bloated salaries, they favor people who do research over people who teach. Because the people who do research are the ones who bring in the big R01 grants and have the big indirect costs. And so that is the perverse financial incentive that we have in US higher education. And it needs to change, and everybody knows that it needs to change. But it's just like, everybody talks about campaign reform or gerrymandering voting districts, but it's never going to change because the people who are making the decisions got there because of the system as it existed. So they're not going to shoot themselves in the foot. And so it's a perverse financial incentive. Anyway, another soapbox.
That's okay. Thank you.
Well, this has been really fun. Good discussion, very wide-ranging.
Well, I know we really, really, really appreciate your taking your time out to share with us. And everybody, I'll post on Twitter about this so everybody who wants can get your Twitter feed if they don't already follow you there. But this means a whole lot to us that you're willing to come and visit with us like this. Tremendously appreciated. And for the crowd that's here, I want to remind y'all that tomorrow we have our second speaker in the series. Spencer, I don't know if I told you, you're our lead off, you're our kickoff. And tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock Eastern is Neil Shubin. He's going to come and spend some time with us.
That'll be fun.
Yeah, he's a lot of fun. And so we are really, really lucky. This, I like to think, is hopefully the highlight of the quarantine teaching for a lot of us
in absolutely.
This. So
strange time.
Thank you enough. And much appreciated. So now go on out and have a great day. Thanks for the morning.
Okay. Namaste.
Namaste. Lovely to meet you.